Let me tell you about the night that changed everything. There are moments that don't look important while they're happening, until you realize they rewrote your entire future. This was one of those moments. It was past midnight in Chicago. You know that time of night when the whole world feels like it's holding its breath? When even the noise of the city seems to fade into this heavy, suffocating silence? That's where our story begins. In that kind of darkness. The kind that makes you feel completely alone. Sophie Martinez sat on the cold kitchen floor of her tiny apartment. Her knees were pulled up tight to her chest, and she had this old, threadbare blanket wrapped around her shoulders, the kind that's been washed so many times it's more holes than fabric. But it was all she had. The lights were off. Not because Sophie wanted them off, not because she was trying to save money or create some kind of mood. No, the lights were off because the power company had shut them off 3 days ago. And you know what? The power company doesn't care about your promises. They don't care that you'll pay them back on Friday. They want their money now, or you sit in the dark. And Sophie? She sat into the dark. From the bedroom, she could hear her 8-month-old son crying. His name was Ethan, and he was crying with that desperate, gut-wrenching wail that only a hungry baby can make. The kind of cry that pierces straight through a mother's heart because she knows, her baby doesn't understand why his stomach hurts. He doesn't understand why he's hungry. He just knows something's wrong and he needs his mama to fix it. But Sophie didn't know how to fix it anymore. Her hands trembled as she stared at the empty formula container sitting on the kitchen counter. That container felt like it was mocking her, laughing at her failure. Tonight's bottle had been mostly water. She'd stretched the last bit of formula as far as it could go, adding more and more water until it was basically nothing. And she'd fed that to her son and watched him drink it down, and she'd lied to herself that it was enough. But it wasn't enough, and she knew she couldn't do that again tomorrow. Sophie picked up her phone with shaking hands. The screen lit up her face in the darkness, and if you could have seen her expression, you would have seen something breaking. Pride, hope, maybe both. She pulled up her contacts and found her brother's name. Marcus. He'd helped before. Not happily, never happily. Every time she asked, she could feel his judgment through the phone. She could hear the disappointment in his voice, the unspoken words that said, "Again? Really? When are you going to get your life together?" But tonight wasn't about pride. Tonight wasn't about what Marcus thought of her. Tonight was about a baby who didn't understand why his stomach hurt. Sophie started typing. Her thumb moved slowly across the screen, each word feeling like she was giving away a piece of herself. "Marcus, I'm sorry to ask again. I need $50 for formula. Ethan's almost out. I get paid Friday. I'll pay you back, I promise." She stared at the message for just a second. Then, without even checking, without even looking at the name at the top of the screen, she hit send. She dropped her forehead to her knees and waited in the darkness. 5 minutes passed. Each minute felt like an hour. Sophie could still hear Ethan crying, but it was getting quieter now. Weaker. He was exhausting himself, and that somehow felt worse than the crying. Then her phone buzzed. Sophie grabbed it so fast she almost dropped it. Her eyes focused on the screen, and her heart stopped. "I think you have the wrong number." Time froze. Sophie's stomach dropped so fast she thought she might be sick. She stared at the message, then looked up at the name at the top of the conversation thread. Not Marcus. 1 digit off. Just one single number different. And she'd sent that message, that desperate, humiliating message, to a complete stranger. Heat rushed to Sophie's face even though she was alone in the dark. Her hands started shaking even harder. This was it. This was rock bottom. She couldn't even ask for help correctly. She couldn't even fail properly. She typed back quickly, fingers fumbling. "I'm so sorry. Please ignore." Wrong number. Then she tossed the phone aside like it had burned her, pulled the blanket tighter around herself, and added this moment to the growing pile of failures that seemed to define her entire life lately. Another failure. Another mistake. Another reminder that she was barely keeping her head above water, and the water just kept rising. 3 miles away, in a completely different world, Alexander Chen stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse apartment overlooking Lake Michigan. The city sprawled out below him like a glittering carpet of lights, but he wasn't really seeing it. He never really saw it anymore. His phone buzzed on the glass desk behind him. He almost didn't check it. This was his private number, the one only family had. And honestly, that list had gotten pretty short over the years. Death, distance, disappointment. One by one, the people in his life had faded away until Alexander found himself exactly where he was right now, alone in a penthouse that cost more than most people made in a lifetime, surrounded by every luxury money could buy and feeling absolutely nothing. But something made him pick up the phone. Maybe curiosity, maybe boredom, maybe just the universe nudging him towards something he didn't know he needed yet. He read the message once, then again. Marcus, I'm sorry to ask again. I need $50 for formula. Ethan's almost out. I get paid Friday. I'll pay you back, I promise. Alexander stood there for a long moment, the phone in his hand, reading those words over and over. This wasn't spam. This wasn't a scam. This wasn't someone trying to get money from a billionaire. They didn't even know who he was. This was raw, real, desperate. He could see the whole story in those few sentences. A mother, a baby, no money, payday still days away. The kind of poverty where $50 meant the difference between feeding your child and watching him go hungry. Ethan's almost out. I get paid Friday. I'll pay you back. This wasn't just a request for money. This was a mother negotiating with her own dignity, bargaining with the universe, promising to pay back $50 she probably didn't have just so she could feed her baby tonight. Alexander knew what most people would do. Delete it, block the number, chalk it up to a wrong number, and move on with their life. Most nights, he would have done exactly that. But tonight, something stopped him. Maybe it was the honesty in those words. Maybe it was remembering what it felt like to be desperate. Back before the billions. Back before the empire. Back when he was just a kid who knew what it meant to go to bed hungry. Or maybe it was because he'd spent so many years surrounded by people who wanted something from him. Investors, reporters, board members, people who smiled to his face while calculating what they could take. And this message was different. This person didn't want anything from Alexander Chen, billionaire. They just wanted to feed their baby. So he typed something he never expected to type. Is your baby going to be okay? He hit send and waited. Sophie stared at her phone like it had just spoken to her in a foreign language. She read the message 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Is your baby going to be okay? What kind of stranger asks that? What kind of person gets a wrong number text asking for money and responds with genuine concern? Her first instinct was to block the number immediately. This had to be some kind of setup, some kind of scam. People didn't just care about random strangers. Not in her experience. But something about the question stopped her finger from hitting that block button. Something about how simply it was asked. No judgment, no mockery. Just a straightforward question that suggested this person actually wanted to know the answer. Sophie's throat tightened. She typed back, trying to sound more put together than she felt. We'll manage. Sorry again. The response came quickly. I can help. No strings attached. Sophie actually scoffed out loud. She shook her head in the darkness of her kitchen, a bitter smile crossing her face. Right. No strings. Because that's how the world works. People just give you money out of the goodness of their hearts with absolutely nothing expected in return. She typed, thanks, but I don't take money from strangers. Smart policy, came the reply. I'm Alexander. Now I'm not a stranger. Sophie stared at that message. Despite everything, despite the fear and the suspicion and the bone-deep exhaustion, she felt something crack inside her chest. Not breaking exactly. More like softening. Just a little. She didn't respond. She couldn't. Because if she kept talking to this person, this Alexander, she might do something stupid. She might hope. And hope was dangerous when you'd been disappointed as many times as she had. Instead, she stood up from the cold kitchen floor, went into the bedroom, and picked up Ethan. He'd finally stopped crying, exhausted from his own hunger. She held him against her chest and rocked him slowly, tears streaming silently down her face. These weren't the loud, dramatic tears you see in movies. These were the quiet tears that come from being broke. But not just broke, tired of being broke, tired of fighting, tired of failing. The kind of tears that come when you realize you've been running uphill for so long that you can't remember what level ground feels like. She rocked Ethan and cried and told herself she'd figure it out somehow. She always did, somehow. Then she did something she never ever thought she'd do. She picked up her phone and sent this stranger, this Alexander, her payment app username. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely type. But she sent it, because what did she have to lose? He'd either ignore it, or he'd send something, or maybe this whole thing was a cruel joke and she'd wake up tomorrow with nothing changed. 3 seconds later, her phone buzzed. Sophie looked at the screen, and her entire world stopped. 5,000 received from Alexander Chen. She blinked, rubbed her eyes, closed the app and opened it again, certain she'd misread, certain she was seeing things. 5,000, $5,000. Sophie sat down hard on the edge of the bed, still holding Ethan. Her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. This couldn't be real. This didn't happen to people like her. Things like this didn't happen in real life. She refreshed the app again. The money was still there. Very real. Very present. Her fingers moved on autopilot, typing, "This is too much. I only needed $50. The response came immediately. "It's already yours. No catch." One less thing to worry about. And that's when Sophie completely broke down. She'd held it together through so much. She'd held it together when she got laid off from her research job. She'd held it together when they repossessed her car because she couldn't make the payments. She'd held it together when Ethan's father, the man who'd promised to be there, who'd said they'd figure it out together, ghosted her the moment he found out she was pregnant. She'd held it together through all of that. But this unexpected kindness from a complete stranger, this shattered her. Sophie sat on her bed in the dark, holding her sleeping son, and cried like she hadn't cried in years. Her whole body shook with it, because someone had seen her. Someone had heard her desperate message and decided she mattered, that her baby mattered. When she could finally breathe again, she picked up her phone with trembling hands and typed, "Thank you. I don't even know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Alexander replied. "Just take care of Ethan." Sophie froze. She stared at that message, her mind racing. Then she scrolled back up through their conversation, looking at what she'd sent him. She'd never mentioned her son's name. She'd said, "my baby." She'd said he, but she'd never typed Ethan. So how did this stranger know her son's name? Sophie couldn't sleep. Even after Ethan finally drifted off, his tiny belly full for the first time in days, his breathing slow and peaceful, she lay awake staring at her phone like it might disappear if she looked away. She kept opening the payment app, checking and rechecking. $5,000. Still there, still real. People didn't do things like this. They just didn't. There had to be a catch. Had to be something dark waiting underneath all this kindness. Maybe he'd want something from her later. Maybe this was how bad things started, with generosity that came with a price tag she couldn't see yet. But another part of her, the part that was so tired of being suspicious, so tired of assuming the worst, whispered, "What if it's real? What if someone just wanted to help?" She opened their message thread again and then typed, "You didn't have to do that." A moment passed, then two, then her phone lit up. "I know I didn't. I wanted to." Sophie's throat tightened. She typed, "Why would you help someone like me? You don't even know me." Across the city, Alexander sat in his office chair, the expensive ergonomic one that had never once actually been comfortable, and stared at her question. Why would he help someone like her? He got messages all the time from people who wanted things, investment opportunities, business partnerships, charitable causes where his name on the donor list mattered more than his actual money. Everyone wanted something from Alexander Chen, but this woman, Sophie, she wasn't asking why he helped. She was asking why he cared. And that was different. He thought about his answer carefully. He could deflect, make a joke, give some generic response about having extra money and wanting to do good. But something about this whole strange interaction felt too honest for that. So he told her the truth, or at least part of it, because once upon a time, someone helped me when they didn't have to. I've never forgotten that. Her response came quickly. I want to pay you back. Alexander's jaw tightened. Of course she did. Even drowning, she was holding on to her pride with both hands. She wasn't asking for more, wasn't hinting at needing anything else. She just wanted to not owe anyone. He understood that, respected it even. Tell me what kind of formula Ethan needs, he typed. I want to send supplies, not money, supplies. There was a longer pause this time. Then, only if there are really no strings. Alexander smiled for the first time in weeks. It was a small smile, barely there, but it was real. Strings are for people playing games, he typed back. I don't play games. The next morning, when Sophie woke to knocking on her door, her heart immediately jumped into her throat. Nobody knocked on her door. Not here, not ever. The landlord texted, her neighbors barely acknowledged her existence. She looked through the peephole and saw a delivery driver in uniform, holding a dolly stacked with 4 massive boxes. Sophie opened the door slowly, confused. Can I help you? Delivery for Sophie Martinez, the driver asked, checking his tablet. That's me? Sign here, please. Sophie signed in a daze and watched as the driver wheeled the boxes into her tiny living room. When he left, she just stood there staring at them. Then she started opening them. Formula, diapers, baby wipes, bottles, organic baby food pouches, the expensive kind she'd always walked past in the store without even looking at the price. Baby clothes, soft blankets, even some toys. Sophie's hands shook as she pulled item after item out of the boxes. This wasn't just formula. This was everything. Everything Ethan needed and more. At the very bottom of the last box, she found a small envelope. Inside was a handwritten note on expensive cardstock. He should have what he needs. Ethan deserves better than barely getting by. Alexander Sophie held that card and felt her eyes fill with tears again. Who was this man? What did he really want? She couldn't help herself. She had to know. Sophie grabbed her phone and opened a browser. Her fingers hesitated over the keyboard for just a moment. Then she typed, Alexander Chen, Chicago. The results loaded instantly, and Sophie's entire world tilted. Alexander Chen, who's CEO and founder of Nexus Innovation Labs. Net worth, $12.3 billion. Former Marine. Tech mogul specializing in AI and medical patents. Media shy. Widowed 3 years ago. No children. There were only 3 photos of him online. In one, he was walking out of a Senate hearing, jaw clenched, eyes hard. In another, he was receiving some kind of innovation award, standing at a podium looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. The third was a candid shot someone had taken of him on the street, and he was glaring at the camera. This wasn't just some generous stranger. This wasn't just a wealthy person with money to spare. This was him. The billionaire tech genius who owned half the patents revolutionizing modern healthcare. The man reporters called the ghost mogul because he refused interviews and avoided public appearances like they were contagious. Sophie's stomach flipped. Why was someone like this helping her? What could she possibly offer someone who had literally everything? She picked up her phone, hands shaking, and typed, Why are you really doing this? She waited. 10 minutes. 20. Her heart sank with each passing moment. Maybe he'd realized his mistake. Maybe he'd looked her up the same way she'd looked him up and realized she was nobody. Nothing. Not worth his time. Then finally her phone buzzed. Because I know what it's like to lose someone you can't save. And because no child should ever feel that kind of pain. Sophie stared at those words. They weren't flowery. They weren't trying to impress her. They were just true, raw, honest. She typed back, I don't want your pity. It's not pity, it's recognition. Sophie sat back against her couch, closing her eyes. She didn't know what to make of this, any of this. Her phone buzzed again. Do you work? The question hit like a punch. Sophie almost didn't answer, almost pretended she hadn't seen it. But something about this whole impossible situation made her want to be honest. I did, she typed, until Ethan was born and the company folded and the daycare I could afford closed. So no, not right now. What was your field? Biochemical research? Diagnostics mostly. I interned at Biogen before things got complicated. There was a pause. Then, you were in research? Sophie smiled bitterly at her phone. Yeah, but I also know how to scrub toilets, make coffee, and calculate taxes I can't afford to pay. She expected him to stop responding after that. Who wanted to hire someone who'd fallen so far they'd gone from research labs to scrubbing toilets? But instead, Alexander sent a message that made Sophie's heart stop for the second time in 12 hours. Come by Nexus Labs tomorrow, 11 a.m. Ask for Diane. No strings, just a conversation. Sophie stared at her screen. Her heart was pounding again. You're offering me a job? His response was simple. I'm offering you a chance to take one back. Now I need you to understand something about Sophie in this moment. She hadn't been inside a downtown office building in almost 2 years. The last time she'd walked into a corporate lobby, she was wearing heels that gave her blisters and a temporary contractor badge that basically screamed, "You don't really belong here." She'd spent months bouncing between jobs that barely paid enough to cover rent, let alone daycare. And then Ethan came, and everything that was already hard became impossible. So when her alarm went off that morning, Sophie lay in bed for a long moment just breathing, trying to convince herself this was real, that she wasn't about to walk into some elaborate setup or cruel joke. But then she looked over at Ethan, sleeping peacefully in his crib, his belly full for the first time in weeks, and she thought, if there's even a chance this is real, I have to take it for him. She got dressed slowly, carefully. She had exactly one outfit that could pass for business casual, a pair of black pants that were a little tighter than she remembered, and a thrifted blouse she'd bought back when she still believed things would get better. She paired it with a blazer that didn't quite zip anymore, but if she didn't button it, nobody would notice. Sophie looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had she gotten so tired? When had those dark circles under her eyes become permanent? But she lifted her chin, took a breath, and told her reflection, "You've got this." She didn't believe it, but she said it anyway. The Nexus Innovation Labs building rose up from downtown Chicago like a monument to everything Sophie wasn't. Glass and steel and money. The kind of building where important people made important decisions that affected the whole world. Sophie stood outside for a moment, holding Ethan in his carrier against her chest, wondering if she should just turn around and go home, save herself the embarrassment. But then she thought about the $5,000 in her account, the boxes of formula, the handwritten note. Ethan deserves better than barely getting by. Someone believed she was worth this chance. Maybe it was time to believe it too. She pushed through the rotating glass doors. The lobby was not what she expected. No ostentatious marble, no giant ego portrait of the CEO, just clean lines, soft lighting, and a quiet efficiency that somehow felt welcoming instead of intimidating. Sophie approached the reception desk, her heart hammering. Hi, I'm Sophie Martinez. I'm here to see Diane. The receptionist looked up and smiled, genuinely smiled, like Sophie was expected, like she belonged here. Of course, we have been expecting you. Take the elevator to the 32nd floor. Ms. Rivers will meet you there. Expected, there was that word again. It made Sophie's stomach flip. She stepped into the elevator and watched the numbers climb. 20 floors, 25, 30, each floor taking her higher into a world she'd never thought she'd see from the inside. When the doors opened, a woman in her 40s with sleek black hair and a tablet in hand was waiting. She extended her hand immediately, her smile warm but professional. Sophie, I'm Diane Rivers, Chief of Staff. Mr. Chen is in meetings this morning, but he asked me to give you a tour first and answer any questions you might have. Sophie shook her hand, trying to project a confidence she absolutely did not feel. Thank you, I appreciate it. They walked through hallways lined with glass offices. Everyone they passed looked busy but not frantic, focused but not stressed. It was the kind of workplace Sophie had dreamed about when she was studying biochemistry in college, back when she still believed hard work guaranteed success. Diane stopped in front of a conference room door. Before we go any further, Mr. Chen wanted me to show you something. She unlocked the door, and Sophie stepped inside. It wasn't a conference room, it was a nursery. A fully furnished, thoughtfully designed nursery. There was a crib in the corner with soft sheets, a changing table stocked with supplies, plush rugs on the floor, a rocking chair by the window, toys organized in bins, even blackout curtains for nap time. Sophie's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes immediately filled with tears. Mr. Chen thought it might help you feel more comfortable, Diane said gently. So you'd know Ethan would be safe and cared for while you're working. Sophie couldn't speak. She walked slowly into the room, taking in every detail. This wasn't thrown together. This wasn't some assistant buying whatever was most expensive. Someone had thought about this, about what a baby would need, about what a mother would need to feel okay leaving her child for a few hours. Why? Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. Why would he do all this? Diane's expression softened. Because he knows what it feels like to walk in alone, to have everyone assume you don't belong. And he never wants anyone who works here to feel that way. Sophie turned to look at her, tears streaming down her face now. I don't understand him. Diane smiled. Most people don't, but I've worked for Alexander Chen for 8 years. And I can tell you this, when he believes in someone, he goes all in. He doesn't do anything halfway. She gestured toward the door. Come on, let me get you some coffee. I have a feeling you're going to need it. 20 minutes later, Sophie sat in a smaller meeting room with a mug of fresh coffee in front of her. Ethan was asleep in his carrier beside her. Worn out from the morning's adventure. Sophie's hands were wrapped around the warm mug, and she was trying to slow her racing heart. Then the door opened. Alexander Chen walked in, and seeing him in person hit Sophie harder than she'd expected. He looked exactly like his photos, tall, probably 6'2", with dark hair just starting to gray at the temples. Expensive suit, but not flashy. Everything about him screamed power and control. But his eyes looked tired, like he was a man who'd built empires but forgotten why. Sophie, he said simply, like they were old friends meeting for coffee. Thanks for coming. Sophie stood up awkwardly, not sure if she should shake his hand or what. I wasn't sure if I should. You came anyway, Alexander said, pulling out a chair across from her. That's what matters. He sat down and looked at her, really looked at her, in a way that made Sophie feel seen. Not judged, not pitied, just seen. Before we talk about anything else, Alexander said, I want to be absolutely clear about something. You owe me nothing, not gratitude, not loyalty, nothing. This isn't a test. I'm not here to rescue you like some kind of savior. I don't believe in charity. I think it's condescending. But I do believe in investing in people who deserve a real chance. Sophie's throat tightened. Why me, May? Alexander leaned back slightly. Because I saw someone who didn't ask for a shortcut, who didn't expect anything, who was willing to go without before letting her child suffer. Someone who, when given an opportunity, said, I want to pay you back instead of, what else can you give me? Someone like that? He paused. I'd trust with anything. He slid a folder across the table. Sophie opened it with trembling hands. Inside was a job offer, temporary position, 3 months, financial audit support, flexible hours, work on-site or remote based on her needs, and the salary. Sophie blinked at the number, then blinked again. It was more than she'd made in 6 months at her old research job. This is real? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. It is. Sophie looked up at him, then glanced through the glass partition at the nursery beyond. In the nursery? Alexander smiled, just barely, like he was out of practice. Also real. For a long moment, they just sat there. Sophie stared at this man who had answered a wrong number text at midnight and somehow decided she was worth all of this. This second chance. This impossible kindness. Finally, she nodded once. I'll take it. Sophie showed up for her first official day wearing the same outfit. It was still her only option. But this time she wore it with something different. Confidence? Not quite. But maybe possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, things were finally turning around. She carried Ethan in a soft gray sling against her chest. The moment she walked in, the receptionist greeted her with a warm, "Welcome back," like Sophie had worked there for years. The elevator seemed to open the moment she approached. Diane was waiting on the 32nd floor with coffee already in hand, made exactly how Sophie had drunk it the day before. "Noah's space is ready," Diane said, walking her down the hallway. "And yours is just across the glass partition. It will get you set up with system access. Let me know if you run into any issues." Sophie blinked. "That's it?" Diane smiled. "That's it." The office they showed her to was modest but perfect. A wide desk, two large monitors, an ergonomic chair that felt like sitting on a cloud. And behind her, that glass partition looking directly into the nursery where Ethan was already cooing at some soft blocks on the rug, completely oblivious to how drastically his world had just changed. Sophie sat down slowly in her chair, her hands hovering over the keyboard. She hadn't worked in over a year, hadn't touched financial systems since her final project before maternity leave, the one that never got finished because the company folded without warning. But as she logged in, opened her inbox, and pulled up the company's audit systems, something familiar stirred in her chest. Her brain clicked back into gear like a machine that had been sleeping, just waiting to be turned back on. She knew what to look for: baseline deviations, inconsistencies between submitted invoices and verified payments, patterns in internal transfers that didn't quite match project activity. It was like picking up an old instrument and remembering the song. Sophie worked quietly for over an hour, her fingers moving across the keyboard with growing confidence. She pulled up quarterly reports, cross-referenced vendor payments, checked authorization trails, and then she found it. Not immediately, not obviously, but there was a pattern, a vendor name that appeared repeatedly: Apex Holdings LLC. The amounts varied, 200 here, 2,400 there, always just under the internal audit threshold that would trigger a review. Never enough to set off alarms. But over the course of a quarter, they added up to serious money. Sophie clicked deeper. The vendor didn't match any real company division. The payments were all routed through what looked like a shell company registered in Delaware. Her stomach tightened. Someone inside Nexus Labs was stealing. Slowly, strategically, expertly. She was about to close the file when she noticed someone standing outside her office. Alexander. He wasn't wearing a suit today, just a black button-down with the sleeves rolled up. He looked more relaxed, more real. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to her office. Sophie nodded. "It's your company." He stepped inside, glanced through the glass at Ethan, who was now attempting to eat his own foot, then turned to her computer screen. "Settling in okay?" "Yeah," Sophie said. "I haven't broken anything yet." "Give it time," he said with that small, almost smile. He looked at her monitor, at the reconciliation files open across her screen. "You're already in the audit folders." Sophie shrugged. "I figured I'd start with third-quarter reports. There are a few inconsistencies in vendor payouts that don't match project records." Alexander's expression changed. Not surprised exactly. More like impressed. "You found that already?" "They're not well hidden," Sophie said, "at least not if you know what to look for." His jaw tightened slightly. "Anything feel off to you?" Sophie hesitated. She'd been here exactly one day. Who was she to make accusations? But then she remembered what he'd said. "I don't believe in charity. I believe in investing in people." "I've only been in the system for a couple hours," she said carefully. "But yeah, either someone's rounding in ways that make no sense, or someone's hiding something in the noise." Alexander's expression darkened just slightly. "You don't have to dig deep yet. Start at surface level." Sophie looked him in the eye. "Except I don't do surface level." He nodded once, something like respect crossing his face. "Neither do I." Then he turned and walked out, leaving Sophie with the distinct feeling that she'd just been given an assignment that went way beyond reconciling invoices. That afternoon, an internal message popped up on her screen. "Keep this just between us. If you find something that doesn't look right, bring it directly to me. No one else, not even Diane. Understood?" Sophie stared at the message for a long moment. Then she typed back, "You expect me to find something?" His response came immediately. "I expect you to see things others won't." By Sophie's second week, she'd built a rhythm. Coffee, a kiss to Ethan's forehead, a silent promise to stay ahead of whatever challenge came next. She arrived early, sometimes before Diane, occasionally even before Alexander, and she always checked on Ethan first. But more and more, she found herself deep in spreadsheets, audit logs, and data trails that most people would find mind-numbingly boring. Sophie didn't find them boring. She found them telling. By Friday afternoon of her second week, she had enough to know for certain. This wasn't an accident. This was theft. Deliberate, systematic, carefully hidden theft. The pattern was clear now. The same vendor, Apex Holdings LLC, repeated just enough times. The amounts varied but shared one trait. They were tied to non-existent project codes, projects that didn't exist, divisions that weren't real, and yet the payments had been processed, approved, and quietly buried under dozens of legitimate transactions. Sophie copied the vendor code into a private encrypted folder and began cross-referencing against employee access logs. The payments weren't going to any standard operating account. They were routed through that shell company in Delaware, the kind of structure that was technically legal, but designed specifically to hide the money trail. Her stomach twisted. Someone inside this company was siphoning funds, and they were good at it. Too good. She thought about what Alexander had said. Bring it directly to me. No one else. Sophie didn't call Diane. She didn't message it. She copied everything to an encrypted flash drive, slipped it into her bag, and sent Alexander a message. I need 5 minutes. It's important. Alexander's office looked out over half of Chicago, floor-to-ceiling windows, but the curtains were partially drawn, like he didn't want to see the view. His desk was surprisingly bare. Just a tablet, a leather notepad, and a framed photo turned slightly toward the wall. He glanced up when Sophie entered. You found something? Not a question, a statement. Sophie nodded and handed him the flash drive. It's not confirmed beyond doubt, but it's enough to raise serious questions. He plugged the drive into his computer and scrolled through the files. Sophie watched his expression shift. Subtle at first, then deeper, more concentrated. You pulled this from Q3? He asked. It spans multiple quarters, Sophie said. The vendor doesn't exist. The payments route through a shell account in Delaware masked under smaller invoices that never trigger audit thresholds. Alexander leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly through his nose. You're right. It's clean. Too clean. Which means whoever did it knows the system, Sophie said. Probably helped design the controls. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. I already suspected something. Sophie crossed her arms. Then why not bring in an outside firm? He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Sophie saw something vulnerable, something raw. Because I don't know who I can trust, he said quietly. Sophie understood that kind of isolation, the kind that came from losing too much, from being burned too many times. It made you question everything, everyone. What do you want me to do, she asked. Keep going, Alexander said. Keep digging, but quietly. No names on emails, no documentation trails. If anyone asks, you're still just reconciling back-end billing records. Sophie tilted her head. You're asking me to investigate your own company. I'm asking you to find the truth. She held his gaze. And if I find something ugly? Alexander didn't blink. Then we deal with it. That night, Sophie lay awake staring at her ceiling while Ethan slept peacefully beside her. She replayed the conversation over and over, trying to shake the unease that clung to it. She wasn't afraid of digging. She wasn't even afraid of what she might find. What worried her most was what she'd already seen in Alexander's face. He already knew who was behind this. He just didn't want to admit it. The next morning, Sophie was at her desk before 7:30, reviewing vendor logs again. This time, she went deeper. The shell company receiving the siphoned funds had a name, Apex Holdings LLC. When she ran the tax ID through a business registry, the address came back to a downtown mailbox drop service. The company listed a single executive agent. No public names, just a legal firm that specialized in corporate anonymity. Sophie sat back, fingers tightening around her coffee mug. This wasn't some lazy embezzlement scheme. Whoever was behind this had designed it to run unnoticed for years. This wasn't greed. This was planned extraction. At 9:06, Alexander walked into her office without knocking. Apex, Sophie said before he could sit down. He raised an eyebrow. It's a holding shell, Sophie continued. No employees, registered through a legal blind. I traced 4 separate payments just this month, routed through different department budgets, all under compliance thresholds. It's sophisticated, precise, professional. Alexander said nothing for a moment. He looked tired again, like he hadn't slept. His tie was slightly crooked. I need you to keep this on your machine only, he said. No backups, no external transfers. Sophie nodded, then leaned forward slightly. Jackson, how long have you suspected this? He looked at her, jaw set. Long enough to know whoever's behind it doesn't care about the company or the people working here. You think it's someone close to you? I know it is. Sophie hesitated. Why haven't you gone to the board? Because at least 2 board members are compromised. They've already shut down 1 internal audit attempt. If I make the wrong move, this whole thing blows up in my face. Sophie's throat tightened. So why me, ahem? Alexander finally sat down across from her. Because you don't owe anyone here anything. And you don't scare easy. The way he said it wasn't flattery, it was truth. And it felt like someone had finally seen her. Not just the struggling single mother, not just the woman trying to survive, but her, the sharp, capable person she used to be before life knocked her down. I want to show you something, Alexander said. He pulled a folder from inside his jacket and slid it across the table. Sophie opened it. A professional headshot stared back. Mid-40s, clean cut, expensive suit, practiced smile. Victor Harlow, Alexander said, Chief Financial Officer. Sophie's blood went cold. She'd heard the name. Victor Harlow had been in several company-wide emails, always signing off on financial policies and system updates. He was hired 2 years ago after the last CFO resigned unexpectedly, Alexander continued. He pushed through changes to our internal systems, gave his own team exclusive oversight over certain divisions, quietly removed several cross-check protocols. Nobody questioned it because he did it all under the banner of streamlining compliance. Sophie closed the folder. You think he's behind it? I know he is, Alexander said. But proving it, that's the hard part. You want me to find the crack in his system? Exactly. Sophie nodded slowly. And when I do, then we move. Alexander stood to leave but paused in the doorway. A small smile crossed his face. The first real one Sophie had seen. By the way, Ethan has fans in the nursery staff. Sophie blinked. What? He gave my assistant a lecture yesterday when she tried to take his stuffed giraffe. It was 4 babbled syllables and a death stare. Despite everything, Sophie laughed. Actually laughed. Alexander's smile widened just slightly. Then he was gone. That afternoon, Sophie worked through lunch. She ran more database matches, cross-referenced internal memos, dug through email archives. And she found it. One email chain where Victor's executive assistant requested override access to procurement logs, citing executive audit preparation. The date matched perfectly with the first recorded transfer to Apex Holdings. Sophie copied it, encrypted it, and added it to a growing folder she'd labeled simply, Proof. By 5 p.m., her eyes burned from staring at screens. She stretched, walked into the nursery, and sank into the soft armchair beside Ethan's crib. He was napping again, thumb in mouth, his other hand death-gripping that stuffed giraffe like a tiny warrior. Sophie rested her head against the back of the chair. It was quiet here. Safe. She hadn't felt this way in a long time, and that scared her more than anything, because she was starting to believe this could last, and believing meant she could lose it. By Monday morning, Sophie had documented 15 separate payments tied to Apex Holdings. Each one routed through a different department. Each one signed off by a different lower-level approver who probably didn't even realize what they were signing. But Sophie had found the pattern, and the pattern had fingerprints. She waited until Ethan was settled in the nursery before walking into Alexander's office. She didn't knock anymore. He'd stopped expecting her to. He was reading a contract, but the moment he saw her face, he pushed it aside. You found more. Sophie handed him a printed report, every page tagged with highlighted notes and system timestamps. I cross-checked every account routed through Apex with employee IDs. The payment approvals all come from different logins, but the access point every single time is the same device ID. Alexander's eyes narrowed. Which means, Sophie continued, someone's using ghost credentials, either duplicating or hijacking existing users to sign off on payments. They're not forging data, Alexander said slowly. They're borrowing real logins. Exactly, that's why your previous auditors missed it. Everything checks out at the surface level. Except it's all a lie, he said quietly. Sophie watched his face carefully. There was no panic, no outburst, just the stillness of someone adding the final piece to a puzzle he never wanted to complete. What do you want to do next, she asked. Alexander picked up his phone. We need confirmation, evidence that can't be rewritten or deleted, and I know exactly where to start. He dialed. Diane, I need Victor Harlow scheduled for a meeting tomorrow. Keep it casual. Mid-morning. Just him and me. Sophie stiffened. You're bringing him here. Alexander hung up and looked at her. If we spook him, he shuts it all down and disappears. If we wait too long, he finds a way to make us the story. And you're okay with that risk? I'm the one who walked into the fire first, Sophie said. I'm not backing out now. Something in Alexander's expression softened. Most people in your position would have taken the paycheck and kept their head down. Sophie raised an eyebrow. Yeah, well, I stopped being most people the day I handed my son a bottle of watered-down formula and pretended it was enough. For a moment, they just looked at each other. Then Alexander said quietly, We're going to get him. But when we do, things are going to get noisy. I want you ready. I'm always ready, Sophie said. I just never had backup before. There was no immediate reply. But a few seconds later, a message appeared on her phone. You do now. The meeting was set for 10 a.m. sharp the next day. Sophie sat at her desk, stomach churning. Ethan was napping peacefully in the nursery, completely unaware that in just a few minutes, a man who had stolen millions was about to sit across from the CEO of the company he'd been bleeding dry. Alexander had told her to stay in her office, but to monitor the security feed. She pulled it up on her second monitor and waited. At exactly 10 p.m., the conference room door opened. Victor Harlow walked in with the casual confidence of a man who believed the world owed him something. Navy blue suit, perfectly tailored, expression hovering between boredom and polite confidence. Alexander was already seated, no handshake. Sophie leaned closer to her screen. Appreciate you making time, Alexander said evenly. Of course, Victor replied smoothly. I always make time for the boss. Sophie studied his face. She'd seen that expression before, in job interviews, in boardrooms, even in line at the grocery store. It was the look of someone who already believed they were 3 moves ahead. I've been reviewing some quarterly financials, Alexander said, and I've noticed some oddities. Victor tilted his head. We've streamlined quite a bit this year. Maybe too fast, that's on me. Growing pains. Streamlined is one word for it. The tension was building, quiet but sharp. There's a vendor, Alexander continued. Apex Holdings. You're familiar? Victor barely blinked. Doesn't ring a bell. Is that facilities or security? Apparently both, and also research and legal. Interesting for a company no one can seem to contact directly. Victor smiled thinly. I'll have my team look into it. You are your team, Alexander said. You approve those payments personally. For the first time, Victor's expression flickered. Alexander leaned forward. I know what you've been doing. I have the logs, device IDs, login footprints, shell account structures. You've been moving money through dummy vendors and distributing it through ghost approval pipelines. And you thought no one would notice. Victor's mouth twitched. Sophie couldn't tell if it was irritation or amusement. You've been listening to your new pet accountant a little too closely, he said. Sophie's stomach dropped. He knew. He'd known she was investigating. Her name is Sophie, Alexander said, voice dropping dangerously low. And she saw what you were hoping everyone else would ignore. Victor laughed quietly. And let me guess, you two have been bonding late at night over spreadsheets and baby bottles. Sophie's hands curled into fists. You're done, Victor, Alexander said calmly. No, Victor replied, smile returning. You're done. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a small flash drive, setting it on the table between them. You think you're the only one who's been collecting data? Come on, Alexander. You're smarter than that. The board's tired of your secret projects and PR disasters. They're tired of your moods, your grief, the way you've made this company vulnerable. I just helped it survive. Sophie leaned closer to the screen, pulse racing. What's on the drive? Alexander asked. Emails, messages, financials that suggest you've been diverting funds to cover personal liabilities. Which, by the way, we both know you haven't. But perception matters more than truth when you're on the chopping block. Victor stood, buttoning his jacket. You've got until Friday to resign. Quietly. I've already spoken to 2 board members. They'll back me. Walk away, and I won't drag Sophie into this. She gets a nice severance and a silent exit. Everyone wins. Sophie sat frozen, staring at the screen. You underestimate me, Alexander said quietly. No, Victor said, heading for the door. I understand you better than anyone in this building. You built something great, but you're too human now. And human doesn't survive here. He walked out without waiting for a response. Sophie closed the feed and sat back, heart pounding. Her face felt hot. All she could think was, we're at war now, and Victor Harlow plays dirty. Alexander didn't return to his office immediately. For 2 hours, Sophie stared at the empty conference room feed, but there was nothing, no movement, no sound. Finally, she couldn't sit still anymore. She printed out her complete report, every documented transfer, every ghost approval, every shell account connection, and walked down the hallway to Alexander's office. He was standing at the window, back to the door, staring out at Chicago like he was watching the city prepare for battle. He didn't turn when she spoke. I saw everything. You weren't supposed to, he said quietly. You really think I'd just sit there and not watch? He turned then, slowly. His face was unreadable, but Sophie could see the exhaustion underneath. I told you this would get ugly, he said. You didn't say he tried to destroy you. Alexander looked at her for a long moment. He has leverage with the board. If I move too soon, he spins this. I look like the unstable billionaire clinging to control. You look like the woman I manipulated to cover my mistakes. Sophie's throat tightened. Then we find proof he can't spin. Alexander stepped closer, took the report from her hands, and flipped through it in silence. When he finished, he looked up. I have one last card to play. It's risky, and it's not guaranteed to work. Define risky, Sophie said. I've been working with someone off the books, former FBI forensic accountant. She's helped me track internal corruption quietly before. But if we bring her in now, it won't stay quiet. Do you trust her? Yes. Then bring her in. Alexander hesitated. This only works if we all play our part. She'll need full access to everything you found. And if Victor catches even a whiff of what we're doing, he'll come after you. Sophie didn't blink. Let him try. That night, Alexander sent Sophie an access code, a private residence owned under a subsidiary company, a safe house in a quiet part of the city, already stocked with everything she and Ethan might need. Sophie didn't ask how he'd arranged it. She just packed. The apartment was small but clean, safe, quiet. Sophie settled Ethan into a portable crib already waiting in the corner, then sank onto the couch, scrolling through her phone, wondering what came next. She didn't have to wait long. A message from Alexander. Her name is Keller. She'll call you in 10 minutes. Pick up. Don't tell her anything you can't prove. She's sharp and she tests people. Sophie replied, ready. 10 minutes later, the phone rang. Miss Martinez? The voice was crisp, professional, all business. This is Keller. Alexander tells me you're the one who found the break in the flow. I'm the one who noticed, Sophie said. He's the one who knew something was wrong. Tell me everything. Start from the beginning. Leave nothing out. So Sophie told her everything. How it began with a text to the wrong number. How she never meant to get involved. How she saw the same patterns everyone else had missed. How that turned into this impossible, dangerous moment. When she finished, Keller was quiet. Then, you're good. Better than most auditors I've worked with. And if even half of what you've told me is supported by the files Alexander sent, we have enough to not only bury Victor, but pull apart everyone protecting him. So what happens next? Sophie asked. We verify. Then we bait the trap. The next 36 hours passed in a blur of adrenaline and black coffee. Keller was relentless. She wanted timestamps, device IDs, access logs, email threads. She wanted everything Sophie had found and more. Sophie handed it all over, every folder, every encrypted backup, even her personal notes. Then Keller laid out the plan. They would leak a fake internal memo about upcoming compliance evaluations, load it into the system where Victor's assistant had access. And wait, the memo went live at 9 a.m. By noon, Keller sent a message. We got a ping. Memo was accessed 3 times in 2 hours. Twice from Victor's team, once from Victor's own login. He knows. Sophie stared at the screen. What's he going to do? We're about to find out. 3 hours later, Alexander called. His voice was quiet but urgent. He's making his move. What did he do? He submitted an emergency ethics complaint to the board. Claimed I bypassed finance protocols and moved funds into personal accounts to bribe an external hire. You. Sophie's chest tightened. He actually named me. He wants you gone first. It's his pattern. Isolate, discredit, remove. He's betting the board won't question it if it comes packaged as internal concern. And will they? Some might, but not all. Not if we go first. Alexander paused. You ready to do this publicly? Sophie looked at Ethan sleeping peacefully in his crib. She thought about the nights without power, the watered-down formula, the kindness of a stranger that was never really about charity. It was about belief. I've never been more ready, she said. The press release hit at 6:43 p.m. Nexus Innovation Labs investigates high-level financial misconduct. It was short, precise, legally vetted. It didn't name Victor Harlow directly, but it referenced forensic irregularities, misappropriation of vendor payments, and a full internal audit triggered by external validation. The same minute it went live, Keller's team handed their findings to the state attorney's office. 38 pages of documentation, system logs, verified approvals, email threads that led directly back to Victor Harlow. At 8:05 p.m., Sophie's phone rang. Unknown number. She answered. Impressive, Victor said. I underestimated you. Sophie didn't speak. I wanted to destroy Alexander, Victor continued. You were just a name on a report, an accident, and somehow you became a problem. Funny, Sophie said, voice steady. That's how most women in power get noticed, by becoming inconvenient. Victor laughed dryly. You think this ends here? You won't win, Sophie. Alexander may crawl out of this, but you're disposable. Always have been. Sophie hung up. She didn't need to hear the rest. By morning, everything was different. The story had gone viral. Finance blogs, tech media, even national outlets were buzzing. A whistleblower, secret audit, executive corruption. One article mentioned a single mother with a background in forensic accounting who uncovered the breach. They didn't name her yet, but they would. The board, blindsided by the evidence, voted unanimously to suspend Victor Harlow pending investigation. Federal charges followed within days. 3 weeks later, Sophie stood in a boardroom as director of internal audit. Not someone's assistant, not a charity case, not the wrong number story people whispered about. The woman who'd exposed a multi-million-dollar fraud while raising a baby on her own. She wasn't scared anymore. Later that evening, Alexander found her working late. Shouldn't you be home? He asked. You told me to build the system, Sophie said. I'm building it. He walked in and set coffee beside her. Go, come on, let's get out of here. They walked through quiet Chicago streets. Finally, Sophie broke the silence. Do you ever think about how weird this all is? Me texting you by accident? Alexander smiled slightly. I don't think it was weird. I think it was the first right thing that happened in a long time. Months later, Sophie stood in her new apartment, her name on the lease, Ethan happy and healthy, her career rebuilt. She opened a message from Alexander containing a screenshot of her very first text titled, The Accident That Wasn't. Thought you might want to keep this, he wrote, so you never forget what it took to get here. You still think it wasn't an accident? She replied. I think the universe is better at hiring people than HR. She laughed. Then typed, what happens next? His response came quickly. I'd like you and Ethan in my life permanently, not just as colleagues, as mine, if you're ready. Sophie read it twice, then smiled and replied, "Ask me again in person." A minute later, her doorbell rang. Alexander stood there holding flowers, nervous for perhaps the first time since she'd known him. "Sophie Martinez," he said, "would you and Ethan consider making this permanent?" She looked at the man who'd answered a wrong number at midnight, who'd seen past her desperation to her strength, who'd given her not charity, but opportunity. "Yes," she said simply, "we would." As Ethan toddled over and wrapped his arms around Alexander's leg, Sophie realized something profound. Sometimes the wrong number leads you to exactly the right place. And sometimes the greatest love stories begin not with a perfect meeting, but with a single act of unexpected kindness that changes two lives forever. And that's Sophie and Alexander's story. A story that started with a mistake and ended with everything they never knew they needed. A story that reminds us, sometimes our lowest moments are just the universe clearing space for something better. Sometimes the help we need comes from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, just sometimes, love finds us when we're not even looking for it. If this story touched your heart, I hope you'll share it, because someone out there needs to hear it. Someone needs to be reminded that they're not alone, that help is possible, that second chances are real. Thank you for staying with me until the end. Until next time, keep believing in those beautiful accidents that change everything.